The judge thought the child was lying, until he pulled out the USB drive. The doors creaked open, groaning against years of old hinges and silence, and every head in the courtroom turned toward the sound. The moment stretched, silent and tense, as a 15-year-old boy stepped into view. He looked smaller than his age, the sleeves of his oversized blazer hanging past his wrists, the hem nearly brushing his knees. Malik Henderson stood stiffly for a moment, as though he'd walked into a place he wasn't meant to be. His shoes echoed with each step toward the witness stand, a lonely sound in a room crowded with people who either pitied him or doubted him. His eyes darted through the room, searching, until they landed on the man who had once given him rides home from baseball practice, brought him snacks, told him he had potential, Detective Grant Huxley. Huxley sat at the defense table like he belonged there, chin lifted, mouth set in a calm, unreadable line. His suit was neatly pressed, his hair combed into the perfect wave, his expression free of worry. Not a single tremor in his body language betrayed the weight of the accusations against him. To anyone watching, he was the model officer wrongfully accused, a man caught in the crosshairs of a society too eager to condemn. But Malik knew better. Malik knew the shadow behind the man's calm demeanor, the weight of secrets hidden behind years of badges and handshakes and commendations. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Though the press had been locked out of the trial, barred by a quiet court order filed by city attorneys citing the protection of a minor, the outside world buzzed with theories and rumors. There were no cameras, but that didn't stop the crowd from hanging on every word that came out of that courtroom. Malik had become a symbol online, a blurry photo from a protest, a quote lifted from a leaked affidavit, a name half-whispered in chat rooms and message boards. Yet none of that followed him as he sat on the cold wooden bench. In here, he was just a boy against a system that already decided what it wanted to believe. Only a handful of people in the room knew the truth. Jerome Henderson, seated in the far back row, was one of them. His arms remained tightly crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on his son with a look that was equal parts pride and pain. Once a respected public defender, Jerome had taken on too many cases that no one else wanted, and made enemies in places where smiles hid knives. After a bar complaint surfaced, conveniently after he threatened to expose prosecutorial misconduct, he lost his license. The charges were vague, but the consequences were clear. With his career dismantled and reputation shredded, Jerome swept floors at the county courthouse now, blending into the same halls where he once fought tooth and nail for justice. The prosecutor assigned to the case had changed 2 weeks ago with barely a word. Caroline Westbrook, a fierce and principled attorney who had pushed for Huxley's arrest, had abruptly stepped down. Personal issues, the court announced. But Jerome knew that wasn't the full story. Caroline had confided in him after noticing unusual interference. Surveillance requests denied, subpoenas mysteriously lost, files delayed by IT errors that always seemed to affect only this case. Now, the replacement sat slouched at the prosecution's table, a man named Connor Briggs, barely in his 30s and clearly over his head. He scanned his phone more than the case file and hadn't asked Malik a single preparatory question. Judge Elston Meyer towered above it all, wearing the black robe like a crown. Meyer had a reputation that stretched back decades, known for throwing the book at street-level offenders while treating law enforcement like family. He'd been on the bench so long people had stopped questioning his impartiality. His courtroom was a graveyard for cases that challenged the city's power structure. Now, he leaned back in his chair, eyes cool and unreadable, as he watched Malik approach the witness stand. The bailiff raised a hand, and Malik was sworn in. The Bible trembled slightly beneath his palm. He sat down and tried to breathe, but his chest felt tight. The light seemed too bright. The ceiling fan clicked overhead like a ticking clock. His gaze drifted toward Huxley again, then quickly away. The moment had arrived. He needed to say the words. All of them. He spoke softly at first, barely audible over the scratching of pens and shuffling of papers. He said that Huxley had been like family, that he'd trusted him, looked up to him. That after his mother died, Huxley had offered to help out, rides to practice, meals when the fridge was empty, advice on how to cope. It had seemed like kindness, like mentorship. But then came the night when he'd stayed over, then the night after that. The lines had started to blur. He recounted how Huxley would tell him he was special, that he was lucky, how he'd warned Malik never to speak to anyone, because no one would believe him anyway. "I know the chief, I know the mayor, I even know the judge," Malik said, his voice cracking as the memory spilled out. The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A low chuckle erupted from the defense side, one of Huxley's lawyers, maybe a paralegal. The judge didn't hide his irritation. He reached for his gavel and struck the wood once, sharp and curt. "Let's stick to the facts, young man," he said coldly. Malik froze. The warmth in his chest drained away. His eyes searched the room. Briggs looked bored, the jury impassive, Huxley unmoved. Even Judge Meyer seemed already halfway to a verdict. But Malik hadn't told everything. He'd held something back, something that could not be argued away or twisted into suspicion. Something he had hidden for weeks inside a hollowed-out school binder, wrapped in an old sock, and kept beneath a loose floorboard in his room. He hadn't dared to bring it to the police, not after seeing how the last detective he trusted betrayed him. He hadn't even told his father, not yet. He waited until the moment came, until the judge's eyes narrowed, until the courtroom's sympathy began to shift into doubt. He had evidence. But this wasn't the moment. Not yet. He would wait. Let them roll their eyes and shrug off his story. Let the laughter linger in the corners. When the time came, he would show them. Jerome watched his son with clenched fists. He could see the weight of that room pressing on Malik's shoulders. He recognized that particular kind of quiet panic, the one where truth feels like a burden no one else wants to carry. He had lived that exact feeling in that exact courtroom. And now it was his son, 15 years old, trying to drag truth into the light against the will of an entire machine. Outside, the city carried on like nothing was happening. But inside that room, war had already begun. 2 weeks earlier, in the still hours before dawn, Jerome Henderson had pushed open the door of their modest two-bedroom apartment and stepped into silence broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. The air was heavy, carrying the lingering scent of reheated leftovers and something else, something sharp, metallic, the kind of tension that hung in the air after someone had been crying for too long. He placed his keys on the counter, shrugging off the weight of his janitor's uniform, every muscle in his back aching from a double shift spent scrubbing courthouse tiles he once strode across in polished shoes and $1,000 suits. He was halfway to his bedroom when he saw the faint light bleeding from beneath the kitchen door. At first, he thought maybe Malik had left the fridge open again, rummaging through it for a midnight snack like he did when his nerves got too loud. But when Jerome nudged the door open, he stopped cold. There, at the table, was his son, curled into himself, arms wrapped around his knees, and his face buried in the crook of his elbow. The light from the overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room, catching the tear tracks dried on Malik's cheeks. His phone lay face down on the table, screen cracked, and beside it, a half-drunk glass of water trembled slightly, as Malik's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Jerome didn't speak at first. He just stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching his boy come apart at the seams. It had been a long time since he'd seen Malik cry like that. Not since the funeral, not since the night they watched the casket close over his mother. But this wasn't grief. This was fear. Raw, consuming fear. When he finally moved, it was slow, cautious, like approaching a wounded animal. He knelt down beside Malik, resting a hand on his back. Malik flinched. The reaction sent something sharp through Jerome's chest. Not the flinch itself, but what it meant. The story came out in pieces, halting and broken like shattered glass being fit back together. About the texts, about the threats, about the way Huxley's voice turned cold when no one else was around. Malik explained how it started with compliments, then favors. Jerome hadn't wanted to believe it. Even as Malik spoke, part of him wrestled with the impossible weight of the accusation. Huxley had coached Malik's Little League team. He'd sat at their dinner table once, wearing a loose tie and laughing at one of Malik's lame jokes. He was the department's golden child, medals, commendations, friendly photo ops with city council members. Just last month, he was nominated for a federal task force on child trafficking, praised in the press as a hero and a champion for vulnerable youth. The idea that someone like that could do something so monstrous, It wasn't just difficult to process, it was dangerous. But when Jerome asked Malik to lift his shirt, and he saw the yellowing bruises along his ribcage, already fading but still too symmetrical to be accidental, every ounce of doubt died on sight. The bruises weren't just proof, they were a sentence, a declaration that safety had long since left their lives and wasn't coming back. Jerome reached out to brush Malik's curls from his forehead, swallowing the lump in his throat as he made a silent promise. No matter the cost, he would get the truth heard. He started with phone calls, friends, old colleagues, attorneys he once mentored before the bar complaint turned him into a pariah. Most didn't pick up. A few offered half-hearted condolences before muttering that they were tied up, or worse, that they couldn't afford to be seen backing the wrong side. One, an old trial partner named Vanessa Kerr, answered with a grave silence before whispering that Jerome should back away before it was too late. "This isn't a case, Jerome," she said. "It's a career ender. Maybe a life ender." Doors closed faster than he could knock. Desperation began to claw at him, and so he took matters into his own hands. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, phone in one hand, a pen in the other, scribbling notes, comparing timestamps, piecing together a timeline of what Malik had experienced. When Malik was asleep, Jerome carefully plugged his phone into an old laptop, running recovery programs to retrieve deleted files. The work was slow, painstaking. Many of the messages were gone, scrubbed so thoroughly that only fragments remained. But some survived, and what he found was enough to make his blood run cold. There were screenshots of late-night messages from Huxley, messages cloaked in the language of mentorship, but riddled with control. Phrases like, "Don't talk to anyone about this," and "You know what happens to liars," appeared between photos of game tickets, encouragement about school, and casual mentions of upcoming check-ins. Then came the audio clips, barely audible at first, but one in particular stood out. A muffled recording, possibly made while Malik had the phone in his hoodie pocket. The voice was unmistakable, calm, measured, but layered with quiet menace. Huxley reminding Malik that the city owed him, that he could destroy a boy's life without ever touching him, that even the judge owed him favors. And then there was the USB drive. Malik had hidden it deep in his room, buried inside a hollowed-out toy truck he hadn't touched in years. It was old, scuffed, the label peeling, but when Jerome plugged it in, he found folders with dates, audio files, and one video clip that stopped him cold. A silent, grainy recording of a dimly lit office, time-stamped 11:52 p.m., showing Huxley placing his hand on Malik's shoulder, leaning in too close, lips moving. There was no audio, but the threat in the body language was unmistakable. The fear on Malik's face was impossible to misread. Back in the courtroom, the storm Malik feared was unfolding exactly as Jerome had predicted. Every time the boy opened his mouth to explain, Judge Meyer interrupted with questions that sounded more like cross-examination than impartial inquiry. The defense pounced on every moment of hesitation, painting Malik as a confused teenager, manipulated by a bitter father with an axe to grind. They even floated theories that Malik had fabricated everything to distract from his failing grades or to gain sympathy after the loss of his mother. The courtroom felt colder with each passing minute. Huxley never flinched. He sat tall, arms crossed loosely, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth whenever Malik stumbled over a memory. He knew the system was his to command. He knew how these cases went. Long, confusing testimony from a minor, followed by a handful of reasonable doubts, and finally, the gavel sealing it all away like it never happened. Just as Judge Meyer leaned forward, ready to strike Malik's last answer from the record under the excuse of hearsay, Malik did something no one expected. He reached into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the small black USB drive. The room froze. For a moment, even the ceiling fan seemed to hold its breath. Malik's voice was barely louder than a whisper, but it carried across the hushed courtroom with terrifying clarity. He said his dad told him that if no one believed him, to show them this. The judge narrowed his eyes, suspicious. He demanded to know what it was. Malik stood from the witness box, holding the USB in both hands like it might shatter. His voice shook, his knees wobbled slightly, but the words came out clean, sharp, and unstoppable. The truth. The silence that followed was absolute. Connor Briggs finally sat upright, no longer glued to his phone. The jurors leaned forward. Jerome, seated in the back, straightened with a slow breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power shifted. Not much, but just enough to feel. And Huxley, for the first time, blinked. Malik didn't cry. He didn't look away. He held the USB in one outstretched hand, and in the other, he clutched the last thread of courage he had left. The judge hesitated. It was clear this wasn't part of the plan. His eyes darted from the USB drive clutched in Malik's trembling fingers to the defense table where Prosecutor Briggs, now visibly sweating, shot up from his seat. The sharp rustle of his suit echoed unnaturally in the still room. He tried to object, voice raised just a touch too loud, insisting that the evidence hadn't been entered into discovery, that its origins were questionable at best. But Judge Meyer, still staring at the boy on the witness stand, held up one hand in a motion that silenced the room. The courtroom air turned heavy, as if every breath taken now was subject to judgment. Jerome, seated behind Malik, locked eyes with his son. He hadn't known Malik had brought the USB with him. Part of him wanted to shout, to object, to shield his son from what would come next. But another part, the deeper, more resolute part that had kept him going through sleepless nights and closed doors, knew this moment had to happen. He had once told Malik that the truth doesn't wait for permission to be heard. Now the truth was speaking. Judge Meyer motioned for the bailiff. The small black drive was taken, walked solemnly across the room like a sacrament, and inserted into the court computer. The screen flickered as the contents loaded, and just like that, the courtroom transformed into a theater of revelation. The first audio file played. It was faint, grainy, but unmistakable. The voice of Detective Huxley, cold and calm, whispering threats to Malik in the back of a cruiser. He spoke of ruining lives, of making people disappear, of how no one would believe a kid with a shaky past and a father already accused of corruption. The words slithered across the speakers, echoing off the paneled walls. A gasp rose from one corner of the courtroom. Somewhere in the back, a reporter dropped their pen. Then came the second file, a video. Surveillance footage from inside the precinct, time-stamped and irrefutable. It showed Malik being led by Huxley through a hallway, down a corridor restricted to officers only. There was no sign-in, no procedural escort. Just the heavy hand of the detective on the boy's shoulder, steering him with unnerving familiarity. The door they disappeared through was labeled Storage 3B. But those who worked the precinct knew it was no storage room. It was an unofficial interrogation space, one that didn't have an official record, one that Internal Affairs conveniently forgot to mention. A third clip cued automatically. This time, the footage captured a heated confrontation in a narrow hallway. Huxley shouting, gesturing wildly, while another officer, a woman in uniform, blocked his path, her voice raised in protest. Officer Keene. She had resigned 2 weeks after that encounter. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. A cold hush settled in the courtroom. Every face turned toward the prosecution table, where Briggs now sat frozen, his hands clenching and unclenching in rhythm. Even the judge seemed rattled, his previous stern demeanor now dulled by what he'd seen. But truth, once exposed, doesn't silence the storm. It awakens it. Within minutes, the atmosphere fractured. Briggs requested a recess, citing procedural violations. An emergency motion was filed to suppress the evidence on grounds of chain of custody. The clerk began fielding calls from city officials even before the judge could respond. The mayor's office issued a statement before the court even adjourned, calling the situation a tragic misunderstanding and urging citizens to trust in due process. News anchors outside spun their narratives. Protesters who had gathered early in the morning, hoping for justice, were now facing freshly erected barricades and a small army of officers in riot gear. Inside the courthouse, the walls seemed to close in on Malik and Jerome. The two of them sat side by side, silent, surrounded by lawyers scrambling for control. Jerome watched as their faces twisted with urgency, flipping papers, making calls, arguing over whether the drive's contents could even be referenced in the next session. But none of them looked at Malik. None of them asked how it felt to hold that evidence in his hand, to offer the truth only to see it contested like a weapon smuggled into war. Outside, protest signs bobbed against the sky. phrases painted in red and black. Believe Malik, no justice, no peace, expose Huxley. Police held the line, their faces covered, their batons resting just so against their hips. Helicopters hovered above, reporters talked over each other, and still, Jerome felt alone. The system hadn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. That night, after the court had recessed in chaos and Malik had been sent home under the quiet guard of trusted friends, Jerome stood alone in his kitchen, hands planted on the edge of the sink. He watched the reflection of the moon shimmer in the window glass, his thoughts tight with everything he couldn't say in court. Malik was safe for now, but the game had changed. What they had hoped would be an open wound of justice was already being sutured by power, stitched closed with procedural jargon and institutional fear. The knock on the door came softly. Too soft for a neighbor, too measured for coincidence. He opened it to find a man in a dark suit, no tie, shoes polished to a military sheen. His face was calm, but his presence filled the doorway with a pressure that made Jerome grip the frame. The man didn't introduce himself. No badge, no card, just words, quiet and clear. If he wanted Malik to graduate, to see college, to grow up free of this weight, Jerome would let the city clean it up its own way. There would be hush money, promises, sealed files. He could walk away. They both could. But only if he stopped. Only if he understood the cost of pushing further. Jerome didn't blink. He thought of the night Malik cried in the kitchen. He thought of bruises that hadn't healed right, of lawyers who vanished, of the silent resignation in Officer Keene's eyes. He thought of all the things he had already buried, his job, his reputation, his fear. But he would not bury the truth. He told the man what he had once told Malik. He had already lost too much. He would not bury his son's truth just so others could keep their secrets. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded once, then stepped back into the night. As the door closed, Jerome knew the cost had only just begun. But he also knew this. Malik wasn't alone anymore, and neither was the truth. The courtroom brimmed with restless energy, a sea of eyes fixed on the bench as if trying to read the intentions of a man who had built a legacy on predictability. But Judge Elston Meyer, once immovable in his convictions and rigid in his rulings, now looked anything but certain. His hands, usually steady as he gripped his gavel, twitched slightly as he shuffled papers that no longer offered the comfort of clarity. His pale skin contrasted sharply against his dark robe, a silent symbol of the pressure weighing on him. He had once dismissed similar claims before, always leaning on the side of law enforcement, but something had cracked. Whether it was the weight of public outcry, the undeniable nature of the evidence, or the haunted look in a 15-year-old boy's eyes, no one could say for sure. The courtroom had grown used to drama over the past week, but nothing had prepared them for this. The leaks had changed everything. What was once a sealed, media-barred trial had become a national headline. The footage from the USB drive, once treated as a side note, had now gone viral. Anonymous whistleblowers had submitted affidavits, timelines, and internal emails to independent watchdog groups. Most damning of all, Officer Keene, missing for nearly a month, had surfaced. In a video recorded from what looked like a bare, windowless room, he confirmed everything Malik Henderson had testified to. He spoke slowly, voice cracked by emotion and fear, outlining how Detective Grant Huxley had operated with impunity, protected by a network of officers and bureaucrats more invested in preserving image than protecting children. Inside the courtroom, tension hung like smoke. Prosecutor Connor Briggs, now visibly gaunt and hollow-eyed, stood at the prosecution's table looking as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. His motions had grown bolder in recent days, though not in the direction anyone had hoped. His latest, an attempt to dismiss all charges pending a vague, further investigation, was his boldest yet. The courtroom knew the weight of that phrase. It was the bureaucratic graveyard where damning truths were buried and never unearthed again. Judge Meyer's eyes flicked over the courtroom. Malik sat silently beside his father, Jerome, both of them still, as if bracing for the final blow. Briggs stepped forward, his voice low, rehearsed, unconvincing as he claimed that the evidence had been tainted, that too many procedural errors rendered it unreliable. He claimed Malik had been under duress, that the viral attention had made the case untenable. As the judge's pen moved toward the dismissal order, Jerome rose. No permission sought. No hesitation. He walked past the rows of seated spectators, the courtroom silent save for the faint creak of the floor beneath his footsteps. He stood not in the witness box, not at the defense table, but directly in front of the bench. The bailiff moved, hand to his sidearm. Security tensed, but Judge Meyer raised his hand, his voice quiet but firm as he halted them. Jerome did not speak with fury. He spoke with the exhaustion of a man who had buried his reputation, his career, nearly his own sanity, in the pursuit of truth. He spoke of a system built not to find justice but to crush those who couldn't afford it. He spoke of boys like Malik, forgotten, overlooked, preyed upon. He painted a picture not of one monster, but of many, the ones who stood silent, the ones who laughed, the ones who looked away. And through it all, he spoke of one boy who hadn't run. One boy who, against all odds, had chosen to speak. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Silence pressed like a weight against every chest. Judge Meyer lowered his pen. He looked again at Malik, not at his size, his age, his background, but at his resolve. And for the first time, Meyer didn't see rebellion. He didn't see manipulation or delusion. He saw a survivor. His voice trembled as he spoke, as if carrying the weight of every case he'd ever buried, every voice he'd ever silenced. He rejected the motion to dismiss, declared the trial would proceed to its full extent. Every piece of evidence would be considered, every witness heard. For a moment, nothing moved. Then it hit. Waves of applause, tears, shouting from the hallways. People outside the building, watching on screens, burst into cheers. Inside, Malik sat frozen, his eyes wide as his father's hand gripped his shoulder. Across the room, Grant Huxley's face turned ghostly. His confident posture collapsed. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Huxley didn't react. For the first time, he looked like a man without a plan. What followed in the weeks ahead was nothing short of a reckoning. More victims came forward. Young men, some barely older than Malik, others grown and hardened, each with stories echoing the same pattern. Officers once considered untouchable were suspended, questioned, indicted. Investigations widened. The city's internal affairs division was gutted and rebuilt. The mayor, who had once praised Huxley publicly, stepped down after recordings surfaced of him joking about overzealous community outreach. A federal probe was launched into the city's justice system. Court transcripts were reviewed. Dozens of old cases reopened. Attorneys who once kept silent came forward with journals, call logs, and secret recordings. The story stopped being about just one boy. It became a mirror to a broken city. Malik never set foot in that courtroom again. His part was over, but his name didn't fade. In the courthouse lobby, where plaques once hung honoring officers of the year, a new monument was installed. It was simple, stone, the size of a shoebox, shaped like a USB drive. No face carved, no names etched, just an engraving beneath it. The words read,